Sounds like this is online. Welcome on this snowy Wednesday evening. Wish everybody safe travels home when we're done. Let's open up to Mark chapter 11. I'm really looking forward to this particular study. I mean, I look forward to all of them, but I'm looking forward to this one in particular just because I think it'll give us some things to think about that we might not think about terribly often. I know when I was preparing for this section we're going to be looking at tonight, found myself thinking about some things that I hadn't thought of before. Cool things. But again, Mark chapter 11. Again, just by way of review, at this point in Mark's gospel, where are we headed? To Jerusalem. And what did you say, Matt? To the cross. Mark is taking us straight to the cross. And yes, Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem, and we're reminded of that right there in verse 1 of this chapter. The text says, as they approached Jerusalem at Bethphage and Bethany, near the Mount of Olives, he sent two of his disciples. We'll pause with that. So we're headed to Jerusalem. We've discussed that pretty thoroughly. Mark's reminding us of that right here. And one thing Mark has been doing in taking us here is just kind of showing us Jesus's movements as they're getting closer and closer to Jerusalem. This is one of those verses where he shows us his movements. They arrive at these places called Bethphage and Bethany, which are probably two villages that are just near each other. And I'll talk about that a little more specifically here in a moment. But they're at the Mount of Olives, and what does Jesus do at this location? Send two of his disciples. Now, with that in mind, obviously Mark does not specify which disciples. It could be two of his apostles, or we also know that at this point there's a crowd following Jesus. They're on their way to Jerusalem. It's Passover time, and that becomes significant in the crucifixion events, but we're not going to talk about that today. But yes, they're here, and Jesus is going to send two of his disciples, whoever they are, off. Now, we also now that is part of the emphasis here, but we also have to pay attention to where Mark says they are when this happens. The locations that Mark mentions here are locations that are directly east of Jerusalem. And that tells us that Jesus and this crowd that's following him are approaching Jerusalem from an easterly direction. And they're probably just within just a few miles of Jerusalem. Now, let's just say for argument's sake, if Jesus was headed into Salt Lake, he'd be in Sandy or West Jordan, somewhere in that neck of the woods, just outside of, in Utah's case, Salt Lake proper, but here it's just outside of Jerusalem. Now, with that being the case, something else we should understand here is that in approaching Jerusalem from that direction, Jesus and his followers would have a great view of Jerusalem. Now, I feel blessed because when Desiree and I took our honeymoon back to the Mediterranean back in 2018, we got to visit the Mount of Olives. And it is a very beautiful sight. When you're on the west side of it, you see the entire city of Jerusalem. You're overlooking it. It's a beautiful sight. And that's the view that Jesus and this crowd would have had, probably even better than what Desiree and I and the people we were with saw. But yes, Mark's point here is that it is from this location that Jesus sends out these two unnamed disciples on a particular mission. And that's what I'm calling it, a mission that involved finding, as Mark will record in verse 2, as Jesus will say in verse 2, I should say, a colt that would serve as Jesus' transport as he prepared to make these final steps into Jerusalem. More specifically, as he prepared to make what has been called his triumphal entry. If you have headers in your Bible, you'll see the header there is the triumphal entry, where Jesus is about to enter into Jerusalem, which is where Mark has been taking us. That's a lot of information. Anything else on verse 1? Okay. So this story that we're about to get into, like we know, Jesus is sending 2 of his disciples, but he's sending 2 of his disciples to find an animal. An animal that Mark shows us is a colt. Now we find a parallel story in Matthew 21. We'll make some reference to that, but here Mark tells us that these 2 disciples are sent off to find a colt. Now this is one of those things that we might not think about too often, but this colt, very important part of the story as far as Jesus's entry into Jerusalem. And there are 2 points that Mark is going to show that I think can be gleaned from the text about this colt. First of all is that the colt was needed by Jesus, verses 2 through 6. And then the second point Mark will make in verses 7 through 10 is that the colt brought praise to Jesus. Now, after looking at these things, the nugget I'm going to leave you with to chew on is that sometimes God does use animals to carry out his will. And I hope we'll see that by the end of our study. So if there's nothing else on verse 1, we'll begin reading in verse 2. Again, this is Mark chapter 11. We'll read verses 2 through 10, then we'll look at the points. Beginning in verse 2 of Mark 11, the text says, "And said to them, Go into the village opposite you, and immediately as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there, on which no one yet has ever sat. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone says to you, 'Why are you doing this?' you say, 'The Lord has need of it,' and immediately he will send it back here." They went away and found a colt tied at the door outside in the street, and they untied it. Some of the bystanders were saying to them, "What are you doing, untying the colt?" They spoke to them just as Jesus had told them, and they gave them permission. They brought the colt to Jesus and put their coats on it, and he sat on it. And many spread their coats in the road, and others spread leafy branches which they had cut from the fields. Those who went in front and those who followed were shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest." We'll pause there. So when we read these verses are really all about this colt and how it was an important part of Jesus entering into Jerusalem. So first point, the colt was needed by Jesus. Verse 2, Jesus tells these 2 disciples what he wants them to do. So what does he want them to do? Okay, say that again, Dean. Okay, to loose it and bring it. So the text says, go into the village opposite you. So Jesus saying, go into this village. It's possible it's either Bethphage or Bethany. Mark doesn't tell us, but so his point here is about what they would find. But the question comes up, and this is the question I'm going to ask you so we can chew on it a little bit. How did Jesus know they would find this? I hear a beeping. Okay, maybe because he knows, but is there another possibility? Well, we'll get into the prophecy aspect of this later. That comes in a little bit later in the story. But here in verse 2, he's telling them what they'll find. How would he know this? What are some possibilities? First of all, Dean told us one. He knows because of who he is, but is there another possibility? Jeremiah, go ahead.
Well, David wrote in on one, and more than likely it's the Passover time, so in turn, they probably had one thing that they learned from king, is every time the king rode in, when Saul was anointed king, he went in on a donkey into Jerusalem on a colt. David did the same thing when he became king. So they're assuming that we're going to have, that their earthly king will come on a colt. And if it's a village close by, maybe somebody just always had one ready in case the person who would come soon showed up.
Okay, so that's another possibility here, is that one was ready. But I bring this up because these are the questions that are sometimes asked of this verse. How did Jesus know they would find one? Possible because he knew. There's a possibility Jeremiah just suggested. But another possibility is that maybe Jesus had a plan in advance. We don't know is the point, but it's something we have to consider. Now, something else we should know at this point is that in Matthew's account from Matthew 21, we learn that what Jesus tells these two disciples is not only that they would find the colt, but they would find a donkey tied there and a colt with her. Now, with that in mind, the story is obviously about the colt. What is a colt?
It's a young animal.
Young horse, young animal, Jeremiah?
The word is actually for donkey, and it's a young donkey that has never been ridden.
Right.
The Greek word for
Yeah, and Jeremiah's right. That is here. It's a young donkey. Now, sometimes it's a young horse, but the Greek term, in addition to what Jeremiah said, could also apply to any young animal from the horse family. But for Matthew 21, we know this is the young of a donkey in this particular case. So, Mark does not tell us about the mother donkey. All he's focused on here is on the colt, because it's the colt that's the emphasis of the story. Anything else on verse 2? Okay. So what else does Jesus say in verse 3? He's given the order. Now what does he say in verse 3? Let him have it. Yeah. So Jesus is basically saying, here's what you should do if you're asked why you're untying this colt. Tell this person the Lord has need of it. So we're running into this word Lord again that we see all throughout the scriptures. What does the word Lord mean? Master. Okay. Any other ideas? Teacher's a slightly different word. But yes, the word Lord could mean master, but it could also mean owner. Now I bring that up because something else we should understand here is that the response Jesus says these two disciples should give to anyone who questions them would indicate to the questioner that the reason these two disciples were untying the colt is because the owner or master, or as our translations say, the Lord needed it. Now, as a result of these things, there are more questions that come up from this verse. More specifically, there are at least 3 different questions that are raised in response to what Jesus has said to these disciples they should say. The first question that is raised in response to what Jesus says the 2 disciples should say is, was Jesus the owner of the colt? That's question number 1. The second question that is raised in what Jesus says here is that if Jesus were not the owner, was the owner with Jesus when Jesus provided this information? Finally, the third question that is raised is that if the actual owner was not with Jesus, the question again becomes, did Jesus make arrangements with the owner to use the colt? We don't have answers to those questions. There's no definite answers, but there are still questions that should be considered when we're looking at verse 3, at what Jesus says here in verse 3. In addition to that, something else we should understand here is that in Matthew's account from Matthew 21, in verse 5 of that chapter, another reason Jesus provided these 2 disciples with this information is because it would fulfill a prophecy. And that's where we're beginning to get the prophecy aspect of this story. In Zechariah 9, verse 9, which Matthew quotes, that Mark doesn't quote here, the text says, "Say to the daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming to you, gentle and mounted on a donkey, even on a colt, the foal of a beast of burden." And that's going back somewhat to Jeremiah's comment about how kings would sometimes ride in on animals like this. So what this all tells us is that what Jesus says to these two disciples, both here in verse 3 and in verse 2, was all part of fulfilling some of the Old Testament prophecies concerning Jesus. A lot of information. I need to take a breath for just a moment, so I'll put it out there. Questions, comments? All right. Well, let's keep trucking into verse 4. What happens in verse 4? Yeah. Jesus told them what they were going to find. They found it. But what information is added here? Where did they find it? On the street. It's tied to a door out in the street. And very simply, they untied it. So Mark adds some additional. Jesus didn't talk about the door and all this on the street. He just told them what they would find. Mark adds this information about where it was found and what they did. So since that's true, something else we should understand here is that one possible reason from the context that Mark adds these details that we didn't see in Jesus' words is to emphasize the fact that the colt was one that had never been sat on. In other words, if you found a colt just tied there to a door out in the street, likely it's never been used before. So that might be why Mark adds this information for us, to emphasize the fact that this colt had never been sat on or ridden before. Questions or comments? All right. So let's go to verse 5. What happens in verse 5? Okay. What are bystanders? People hanging around. They're seeing what's going on. They ask this question, what are you doing untying the colt? What are they really asking? Okay, that's one way to look at it. But what did Jesus say might happen when he was giving the instruction? Verse 3. Okay, that's the response. But somebody might ask why. Now, here in verse 5, the question is not phrased that way, but that's the idea behind the question. Why are you untying the colt? What are you doing? Why are you doing this? So it's not specifically a why question, but it is why is behind this question. So this is something else that Jesus said might happen, and it did happen. Because the question these bystanders ask is still a question that asks about the reason these two disciples had for untying the colt. Anything else on verse 5? Okay. Verse 5 presents the question. Verse 6, what's the response? Exactly. They're doing what Jesus said, and what Jesus said would happen, happened. That's what Mark is doing in verses 4 through 6, is showing, for lack of a better term, the fulfillment of what Jesus said would happen. So they've asked why. They told them what Jesus said to tell them, which was what? What did Jesus say to tell them? The Lord has need of it. So they do just that. Now, in addition to all that, I think something else we should consider here is that it's possible that Jesus may have had some influence over these bystanders, even though he was not physically present. Now, I just want us to consider that. The text doesn't say that, but it's something to consider because of who Jesus is. The possibility is there. So, but again, the point from the context is that everything Jesus said would happen, happened. Permission was granted to use the colt. So putting verses 2 through 6 together, the point about the colt that we see in these verses is that the colt was needed by Jesus. He needed this. It was all part of the plan. And so since Jesus needed it, what he does is send these two disciples with very specific instructions about this cult and what to do about when they were questioned, or what to do if they were questioned about why they were taking it. Anything else on verse 6? All right. Verse 7. We're moving to the next phase of the story, the second point. The cult's been brought back, and the point we're going to see in verse 7 through 10 is that the cult brought praise to Jesus. But again, verse 7, the cult is brought back. What happens in verse 7? Okay. Why put the clothes on the colt? I have not. Okay. Explain that, Dina. Okay. All right, it's not would not be comfortable at all. Now, when you're looking at a horse, you put something on the back of the horse. What do you call that?
Well, it depends. You could have a saddle blanket.
It's a
Saddle.
exactly. It's a saddle type. Jeremiah, was your hand up? Sorry, go ahead.
But we have to remember culture. They did not do this.
Yeah.
The only people that had this happen was when a new king came in. They did this. No one else had clothes. Put our garments put on, is the actual Greek word for it. Would be garments put on the donkey. No one else did it. It's like, in our times, we would think we would do it. They didn't do it. You go back and read. It was a new tradition when Saul came in and became the first king. They did it, and they talked about it then. And then they talked about it for David, but they don't talk about it when anybody else is writing. That's the only time they talk about it. And Josephus talks about it as a Jewish tradition for when a new king comes into Jerusalem, the people, the disciples, or whoever it is, would take off their outer clothes and put them on there as a tribute to the king.
All right, that's important to remember here. It's the outer clothes. Now, the American Standard has the word coats, but it is an outer garment. It's not their clothes they wear on their skin. It's just what they're wearing on the outside of the regular clothes. But this is functioning as a saddle, and we'll see more in verse 8 that this has to do with them recognizing Jesus as a king to some degree. Anything else on verse 7? Okay. So verse 8 continues the thought of verse 7, but now what's happening in verse 8? So what are they doing? Jeremiah's kind of already told us. What are they doing? Preparing the way for the king to enter. In our circumstance, they're laying out the red carpet. Using their clothes, it's still these outer garments. Their leafy branches. This says leafy branches. Matthew 21 says palm branches, from where we get Palm Sunday. But they're recognizing Jesus as king. This is, as Jeremiah has told us, this is something that goes way back into Old Testament history about how a king would be welcomed into a city. Now, one instance in the Old Testament that we have this is in 2 Kings 9, verse 13. There's an individual named Jehu who's claiming to be king, and they're doing this for him, saying, Jehu's king. But here, it's Jesus that's being treated as king. Now again, at this time, the Jewish mindset is Jesus is this earthly king. He's coming in, set up his kingdom, kick the Romans out of power. They still don't understand, even at this point, that Jesus is a spiritual king. Not this earthly king who would have expected this kind of treatment. Anything else in verses 7 or 8? Okay. So since Jesus is receiving this treatment given to a king, Mark in verse 7 and 8 has shown what they were doing. Now in verse 9, he's showing what they're saying. It says, those who went in front and those who followed were shouting, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Now before we get into the statement itself, at the end of the verse we have this idea of the name of the Lord. Can anyone remind me what it involves? The name of the Lord. Authority. In this case, it has to do with the authority of the Lord. Now, putting that into this statement, what Mark is recording here in verse 9 is the first of a two-part statement that extends through verse 10, where the people here were shouting a statement of praise. Now, this statement of praise has its roots in Psalm 118, verses 25 and 26. In that psalm, the psalmist is calling on God to save him and praising God for sending someone who comes with his authority to save the psalmist. Now, one reason we know salvation is involved here is because of this word, Hosanna. Some of our songs have this word, Hosanna. What that word means, it comes from a Hebrew word that means save us. And in Psalm 118, verses 25 and 26, it's combined with this phrase, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Again, the psalmist has asked God to save him, but now he's praising God for sending someone to save him. That someone is a person who comes with the authority of the Lord. But here, the language of Psalm 118 is being applied to Jesus, where people are recognizing Jesus as being the one that God sent to save them. Now again, in the Jewish mindset, they're thinking physical salvation, not yet understanding that what Jesus is really bringing is a spiritual salvation. Now, just as a side note, Jesus, as we know, he's headed into Jerusalem. This is the last week of his life that we've reached. Day 1, Jesus is being treated as king. Day 7, he's going to be treated as a criminal. But we'll see that as we move through these last few chapters of Mark. Anything else on verse 9? Okay. I know I'm giving a lot of information here. But going on to verse 10, we find the second part of the statement from verse 9. The text says, blessed is the kingdom of our father David, Hosanna in the highest. So one question I want to ask you guys here, what does David have to do with all of this? David's kingdom, I should say.
Well, it sounds like to me they're thinking the real king that's going to be in the future there, the real king being the earthly king.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I think they believe. Yeah.
Well, what?
They're comparing him to that King David.
Okay.
That sounds like that to me.
Okay, they're comparing him to King David, but what else does David's kingdom have to do with all of this from the Old Testament? Exactly. That was part of the prophecies, that the Messiah, the Christ, would come from the line of David. People are thinking Jesus is this one. So now they're making this statement of praise, not directed directly at Jesus, but praising David's kingdom because of what they knew to be true from the Old Testament. So Mark is now recording the second half of the statement from verse 9 that also has its roots in Psalm 118. But something else we should understand here is that what is said here is that God is being praised for the fact that through the line of David, God would establish his kingdom. And as a result, save his people. Because what word here in verse 10 is repeated from verse 9? Hosanna. The save us word. But it's expanded to say Hosanna in the highest. What does Hosanna in the highest mean? In other words, who's in the highest position of authority? God. So when you say Hosanna in the highest, what does that mean? God in heaven. You're relying on God for salvation. That's what Hosanna is, the idea behind Hosanna in the highest. Salvation coming from the highest possible place, from God. And his salvation would come through the line of David, through the Messiah. That people are reaching the conclusion that Jesus is, at least from an earthly standpoint. Anything else on verse 10? All right. So putting all these things together, the point we should see from verses 7 through 10 about the colt is that the colt brought praise to Jesus. Mark has shown that Jesus riding in on the colt is something that brought him praise. Again, based on Matthew's account from Matthew 21, one reason this is the case is because Jesus riding on a colt in the way that he was a fulfillment of some of the Old Testament prophecies concerning Jesus. As a result, those who witnessed this happening were shouting these statements that we just read and examined a little bit more closely that have their roots in Psalm 118. So, when we look at verses 1 through 10, putting it all together, the point we should be left with is that the colt of these verses, the colt did something for Jesus. It was needed by Jesus. It brought praise to Jesus. So again, one application from this that we might not think about is that sometimes God does use animals as an instrument of his will. Since that's true, we must see that animals are an important part of God's creation. One reason they're important is because they're sometimes used to bring praise to him. And so we must take time to be thankful that God has created animals. Some might see them as a nuisance, but God created them. So we should be thankful for them, in some ways. Again, that's just some applications of this text. Anything else on what we've studied tonight? All right, Dean, will you close us tonight?